So, hello and welcome to our second ShotPros webinar about VR requirement engineering today. I see that most of our attendees are already present. My name is Valerie. I'm responsible for dissemination and communication in the ShotPros project, and I will just start with a short introduction today before I hand over to our speakers. If you have any questions during the webinar, just feel free to use the chat function. We will do our best to answer those questions during or in the end of the webinar. Today, our speakers are Emma Jaspert from the KU Leuven. She's an expert in end-user research and is the lead of the requirements in ShotPros. And Nick Svaneveld from Relion. He's our expert for technical requirements and VR training, and also the technology partner in ShotPros. I will hand over to our speaker, Emma, now, and she will start with the presentation.
Good afternoon, everybody. I don't know, Nick, can you confirm, is it are the slides in slideshow mode or not? They
Yes.
are? Oh, perfect. Okay, because I was having some troubles. Thank you, Valerie, first of all, for the introduction, and thank you, all of you, for joining this webinar on VR requirements engineering. So as Valerie already mentioned, I'm Emma. I'm a researcher at the University of Leuven, and indeed in the ShotPros project, I was responsible to collect the user requirements for the VR training tool that we are developing together with Nick and other partners. What we want to talk to you about today is, yes, VR requirements engineering, and oh, yes. You see the next slide? Okay. This is no, you don't. Oh. Wait, I will try here.
Yes.
No? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have to. So what we want to talk to you about today is VR requirements engineering. First of all, I will briefly frame this webinar within the current ShotPros project, because of course we cannot deal with all requirements analysis, so we had to already limit the scope a bit of this this webinar to police training development. But of course, many of the things we will mention are applicable to other types of system developments. Then I will briefly explain what user requirements are, and we'll go through the requirements analysis process with you. And then, of course, I will also tell a little bit about user requirements methods that we used in ShotPros and that can be used for other projects as well. And then in the end, Nick will take over, and as he's an expert from the developer's perspective, he will go into more detail about the steps that they take together with the users to complete the system and to deliver a final product. Okay, next slide. Okay, so first of all, a little bit of context. So our project ShotPros started from, it's a Horizon 2020 project, and it started from the observation that police nowadays are under constant scrutiny in our society. So they are often first responders in the field. They arrive at scenes first, and they have to make a lot of split-second decisions in often difficult circumstances. So there's a lot of pressure on police and police officers to perform well at any time, even in high stress and high risk situations. But research has shown that the traditional training methods, such as classroom-based training or shooting range training, or just limited scenario-based training, that they are often insufficient to really transpose the skills and the capabilities that they have learned into real-life situations, especially when they are under high stress or in high-risk situations. Research has shown that there is a decline in police performance. And so what ShotPros wanted to do was to actually improve decision-making and acting capabilities of police officers in high-stress and high-risk situations. And what we found was that a very good tool or method to train these kind of skills is scenario-based training. Why? Because a lot of the traditional training methods, they fail or they don't sufficiently improve skills because they lack because police officers are not in the same cognitive or physical or mental state as they are in real life situations. So once there is an added stress factor to situations, suddenly their performance declines. And scenario-based training tries to do exactly that. So it tries to put trainees into situations where they kind of mimic similar stress levels, similar emotional states as police officers would encounter in real life. And of course, creating scenario-based training, you can do it via live simulations, which is often the case in police academies, but they are often very difficult to set up. It's very time-consuming, very costly, and so you cannot do a lot of trainings with live training in a year. And there, VR can offer a very interesting solution, as when you develop scenarios, you can reuse them anytime you want, and you don't have to mobilize tens or hundreds of people as actors or figurants to help you. So VR is really a very promising tool for scenario-based training and as such for police training. Now, when we started this project, it was important that we started it from a user-centered design. So we wanted to take the users with us through every step of the development process, because it's important when you are developing a system or a tool for certain people that they will, in the end, be able to use it, want to use it, and that it's a good tool to use, so that it also meets their needs and what they want from the tool. So that's the idea. So taking on board users is a very critical part to the success of a project or of a system development. So user requirements analysis is in fact the collection of the needs and requirements from the ultimate end user, so the people who will use the system, who will use the product, and also taking into account the constraints under which a system must operate. For example, organizational constraints, budget limitations, etc. So really collecting user needs and user requirements is almost the fundament of good system development. You have to know what they want, you have to know what they need, and then you can design a product that is as optimal as possible to meet these needs. So how do we start? It's difficult to pinpoint exactly a process that is always the same, because it depends a lot on the information that you collect in the different stages. But roughly, we set up this process which starts from certain operational needs, so observations in the field that something is not going as it should be, or that there are some issues or some problems, and then all the way to the actual development of and delivery of a system that can help meet those needs or alleviate those needs. And so there's a process in between where we go from very wide to very narrow, so more specific. And it starts with gathering information, and then the user requirements are more and more refined and more specific. And then at a certain point, it will go over to developers who will take these requirements into consideration and propose and develop the best possible solution to meet those requirements. So the first step in the user requirements process are the operational needs. So what do we consider to be operational needs? It starts from an initial problem statement. So people encounter some issues in the field, for example, or they encounter some issues in the field, and they can be quite broad, but they can also already be quite specific. For example, specific problem statements can be that our officers are not sufficiently able to contain crowds. We have had some issues with crowd control, crowd management. There seems to be some issues with how they handle it, so that is something that we need to tackle. But it can also be that they find that officers lack the sufficient communication skills to deal with victims of violent crimes, so that the aftercare of victims is sometimes lacking. And so then your need is quite specific already, but it can also be much broader. For example, nowadays there is a perception of citizens that police officers might use racial profiling techniques in their work on the field. This is a pressing issue, but it's very broad. It's not, you cannot reduce it to a specific type of intervention or to a specific situation. So it's much more broader. And the same was here in ShotPros, because our problem statement was that officers tend to not perform optimally when they are in high risk and high stress situations, even when they are well trained. So that is a problem statement that is quite broad, and it will change the way that the next phases will take shape. From this problem statement, we can already formulate some initial needs. Because if I say, okay, the officers don't perform optimally in high stress situations, I could say, okay, there's a need for better training methods or to improve our current training program. But other questions can have also other needs that are not related to training. For example, with the crowd control, we can say, okay, we need a better camera system that covers all the areas, all the risky areas in our city, so that the squares are fully captured on video. Or we can have, we need a better communication procedures between first responders. So it doesn't always have to be a training solution. It can also be another type of tool or solution that is the initial need. Then once the problem is identified and we already make explicit some initial needs or ways to go forward, we can start by really starting the collection of user requirements. And in the first phase, this will be gathering as much information as possible from as much different channels as possible. For example, we would need information on the users who will use the system that we need to develop. What is their function? How will they influence the way that our system has to work, and how will our system impact them? So we really have to do some stakeholder mapping and to see which actors or stakeholders we have to involve in the collection of user requirements. And in the case of training, the most obvious users are the police trainers themselves and the police trainees, but other users could also be society, so citizens, civilians, but they can also be policymakers who have to decide on budget and on making the decisions on whether or not they want to implement a certain tool. They can be maintenance personnel that need to make sure that the systems or the tools are in functioning and working condition. So the users can be quite diverse. Another piece of information that we have to learn more about is what are the current processes, what is the current situation. For example, how is the training in dealing with stress during interventions now performed, what is currently the state of the art in training in police academies on that level, and what might be lacking, what might be needed, in which type of organization does it take place, more specific practical details, how often are they trained. So it's really to get a better understanding of the issues that we are facing and the problems that we have to solve. Then the final one, and this is, for me as a researcher, maybe it's a very important one, but I think it's also very important, especially when you have broad problem statements that are difficult to really pinpoint what exactly you need to tackle to deal with the issues. For example, how can we train people to deal with stress better during police interventions? So we have to also understand what the problem is, to understand the processes that are in place. For example, we need to know from users what are, for them, what are high risk, high stress situations. Can they think of situations in which they felt that they performed suboptimally, and how did the stress express itself, and how did it influence their decision making? Because sometimes it can also be positive, that stress is a positive influencer, that it can make you more alert. But so what's the difference? When does it become a negative impact for your decision making? For example, what kind of elements increase your stress levels? So what are factors that you can encounter during your interventions, or other factors that might be more stable, such as personality or organizational factors that influence your decision making processes in the field? So all these questions also need to be answered to understand the processes that you have to intervene in. Because if you don't understand the processes and you just start developing something and think it will help, then you risk spending a lot of money on something that might not be effective in the end. So I think it's important to gather also information about those elements to really understand what is needed. So to make it very clear where you have to kind of intervene in these processes. So in the gathering information, this can be done with users. You can also use methods that you use for user requirements and user needs. You can also do other types of stuff. So you can read through all the training programs that police academies have developed. You can do observations in the field, observations in training. So there are a lot of, look into the literature on the relationship between stress and decision making, for example. So there are a lot of data inputs that you can use to really triangulate and to develop a better understanding into the current situation and the users and the problem. So once you collected some information and you have a better idea of what is going on and what is needed, you can start by really collecting and identifying the user requirements. And especially in terms of training, I added the identification of training needs. So based on all the information, you can, together with your users, brainstorm about what exactly they want from a new training on learning better decision-making and acting skills under stress, who they want to train, how often they want to train, when and where they want to train, in groups of 4 or 2 or individual training, do they want 4 or 5 different training sessions a year or each week? So all these elements, they will change also the possibilities or the tools that can be developed. If you want to train once a year, or if you want to have your trainees train every week, then maybe you will have to have a different system in the end. Excuse me. So there you can also kind of try to preliminarily identify maybe appropriate training methods. And in the ShotPros project, it was here that we also understood that scenario-based training would be the way forward for us, because we wanted them to train as much as possible, and we wanted them to train different situations and in different kind of stress levels. So scenario-based training was the solution, or we consider to be the path that we want to explore further. Then next, I think that's the most important part of user requirements collection, is that on the one hand, you want to learn more about the system that you will be developing. So you want to have a VR training tool. So what should the system, the VR system, look like? How would you what functionalities do you want the system to have? What should it be able to do? Which steps should you have to take throughout the training? And so it's really concerning the development of the tool, the system itself. For example, in our user requirements collection, we got information about they wanted to use their own gear. They wanted their own tool belt and their own weapons, and they wanted data to be shared with other trainers. They wanted scenarios to be shared with other trainers. Some felt that trainees should have a personal dashboard where they could review their trainings and see their process throughout trainings. There are questions on what kind of elements should the interface have? How can we develop our own scenarios? So all these elements have to do with how the system should function, how it should operate. And of course, you can in user requirements, it's often the case that you can think freely without a lot of constraints, or already without limiting it to a certain tool or system. So officers have the chance, or participants have the chance to think really freely, and sometimes they kind of think about very idealistic situations where everything is possible. And so at that moment, it's also important to maybe distinguish between functional and non-functional requirements. So which requirements are really a must-have to make the system work, and what other requirements are nice to have and would be interesting to implement, but would not compromise the functionality of the system as such. So because you cannot develop everything, so it's important there to try to distinguish what is priority and what is nice to have if possible. Then the next step is, okay, you have your system. So you are able to perform a training trajectory, but then of course you also need content. So what are you going to train? And especially in scenario-based training, an important aspect there is that you have to develop scenarios. And when you have very specific operational needs, for example, with the crowds, so we want to do better crowd control, better manage crowds, then of course you will have to think about a scenario in which you expose trainees to maybe a crowd that starts to get aggressive, or football hooligans. So you have to think about which scenarios you want to train and which elements should be included in those scenarios. When you have more broad operational needs, such as in our project where you say, okay, we want to train better decision making, it's much more difficult to pinpoint exactly in which scenario you want to train, because actually decision making is inherently present in all interventions that you do. So then you can use your information that you gathered in the beginning about what they consider to be high stress situations, and you can also already deduce possible scenarios from that. And then you can say, okay, they want certain stressors to elevate stress. So you can, based on the information that you gathered, you can start to narrow down and in the end come up with one or more scenarios that you have to develop further. So the content of the training, of course, is a very important part and should be as maximal as possible, but this is a researcher speaking, should be evidence-based. So that's why we also try to combine our user requirements analysis with other research, because we have information from the users on which elements they feel increase their stress levels to reach negative levels. So we know which stressors they have given us, but then we also now combine it with research, empirical research, where we do experiments to see which stressors actually in fact do elevate stress levels, and those stressors will be included in the end because they show that they have the biggest impact, for example. So we try to combine it with other elements as well. But so in the first phase of scenario development, of course, we cannot, as users, we cannot develop a scenario that is exactly what developers need to have to implement it. So the first steps of scenario development are coming to an operational scenario. So to describe the situation, to describe the environment and what happens. And then later on, the developers, the VR developers, will use this as a basis to further refine the elements that they have to implement. But so what and how should we define it? So what should we define in an operational scenario? First of all, we have to define the intervention. For example, in our project, we decided to develop a domestic violence scenario. So that's the starting point. We develop a domestic violence scenario, and then we have to think about the environment. Where does this scenario have to take place? Is it outside, inside? Do we need a street? Is it an apartment building? How does the apartment building look? How many rooms are inside the house? So think about these elements. Then we also have to think about sensory conditions. So for example, lighting. Do we want a lot of light? Do we want to have darkness? Is it night outside? Do we have flickering lights? But also other sensory elements such as sounds. There's a loud noise, or you hear sirens in the back, or do you hear screaming or shooting? All these elements you have to think about. In some cases, you could also explore possibilities to include smell into such a scenario. Then objects, what kind of objects do we need to include in a scenario? Maybe a car, maybe a dog bench, or we need some knives on the kitchen table, or we need broken bottles or drugs on the table, or a lot of rubbish everywhere. So also these objects are important. And then of course actors. You can have, of course, your suspect and maybe a victim, but you can also think of including actors that are very difficult to include in live trainings, which is another plus benefit of VR. For example, working with animals and with children is very difficult in real life simulations. So VR can provide some opportunities for that, to include children characters or dogs that run around or bark at you. So also bystanders, all these elements should also be identified. And then very important for our project, but also for other training, is what kind of stressors do we want to include? And so you can have a very basic scenario of domestic violence where people, police officers come in and they see two people shout at each other, and they kind of talk to them and they calm down, and you take them with you to the bureau. But you could also think about what kind of stressors you can add to make it more stressful, or to make it suddenly a very different situation where officers have to react quickly and make quick decisions. So you can have people suddenly starting to film you on the street, or you can have one of the actors suddenly grab a gun from under the couch, or you can have suddenly a child that starts running towards you. So it gives you some surprise elements that you can play with to really increase stress levels and so also maximize training potential. And related to that, you can also think about different levels of complexity in a scenario. And in our case, that is something we are exploring because, of course, not everybody. It will also depend on the users that you have identified, but not everybody starts from the same training level. So some people will be novices and will just start at academy, and others will be quite experienced police officers with a lot of field experience. And so it can be interesting to have different scenario complexities. And in our case, it is dependent on the number of stressors that we include, and so how elevated we want your stress levels to go. So you can have low stress scenarios, medium stress, high stress. And to accomplish this, we are also working on a study on a survey, which is also a collection of user needs in a way, where we ask a lot of police officers to rate different types of stressors that we identified in the user requirements workshops with our police officers. To rate all these stressors on how stressful they perceive them, and hopefully in the end we can be able to develop a support tool for development of training scenarios in which you can say, okay, I want medium stress level scenario, so what kind of stressors or what combination of stressors can we implement to reach a medium stress level? So that we are currently working on that with the Belgian Crisis Center, also in the context of ShotPros. And then quickly a few words on how you can gather user requirements for these kind of goals. Is what we did for information gathering is we conducted focus groups in 6 different law enforcement agencies. We had a total over all the focus groups of 60 participants. And we asked them in focus groups with about 10 people each time is what are stressful and high-risk situations to you? How do you see that you're highly stressed? What is the difference between positive and negative stress? Because it was something that came up a lot of times. What elements influence your stress levels or your decision-making capabilities? So these are questions, very open questions that are ideally for focus groups. And you can use some affinity diagramming, which you see on the photos, where actually the information that they give us through brainstorming and through discussion with each other, we try to kind of synthesize them into small post-its, and then try to on the spot already make certain categories to kind of group certain elements together to structure it for ourselves and for the participants, which will facilitate the discussion, and they can see, okay, this category, there is something lacking, I think this should also be included there. So we give them the opportunity also play with the structure and to maybe add or change things along the way. Another method that we used is the wants and needs analysis. To us, this is particularly useful for collecting requirements concerning the system. So we called it the VR requirements. So what do you want the system to be able to do? So we asked them to brainstorm first in pairs. We gave them some papers and they could write down ideas that they had. So, okay, what would we like to have, or what do we want the system to be able to do? And also to explain a little bit why. Why is it necessary? What purpose does it have to have this feature included in the system? And we also asked them to mention or to identify this specific requirement as a need to have or a nice to have. So we try to really prioritize already from the beginning the different requirements that they have. And so again, we let them brainstorm, and then we discuss in groups, so everybody can pitch their ideas, and we try to put it down on a board and to structure it and group it. And then at the end, and this is interesting for the wants and needs analysis, we asked them to again prioritize from the board or from the post-its which ones they felt were most important. So we got some clusters of requirements that were more important or were deemed must-haves, and others that were less important. So it really helped us to identify the most pressing issues, the most important requirements. And then another method that we used, which was really a fun way to collect more information for the content. So on scenario building, it really helped us to identify what types of scenarios they mentioned most, and we asked them also to really think about the opportunities VR could give for training and what scenarios they would specifically like to train in a VR environment. And so we used co-creation with Lego Serious Play. So it was a co-creation workshop in which we first got them accustomed with playing with Lego. We had a 1-minute challenge of making the highest tower, and it made everybody comfortable and a very nice informal atmosphere. And then we asked to brainstorm together about possible scenarios that could be used for training this specific goal, which is to train people to still perform appropriately in high stress, high risk situations. And then we asked them to build actually the scenario that they think that this VR training tool should comprise. So they had a lot of ideas about school shootings, or a traffic accident in which there are multiple injuries, but we had a lot of armed robberies or car stops, vehicle stops where you find weapons in a car. So there were a lot of different ideas and different designs. So it was a really fun way to really understand better the scenarios that they envision and to discuss it with everybody, so they could explain what they built, and we could ask questions, and they could show with the little figurines what would happen and where everybody would stand and go and why. So it was a really interesting way to collect user requirements. Of course, these are not all methods that you can use to collect requirements. We also did survey research. So we asked people some questions about themselves and about their levels of experience, and to see what their user types were. We also conducted interviews. Other partners in our project did observations of trainings. We did, so there are many different ways to collect user requirements. You can have diary studies where you ask people to keep a diary every day. You can also have already some prototyping, because sometimes you already have a system in place and they can test the system, and you go through with them through the different steps in the system and ask them for constant feedback. What do you like? What don't you like? So that are also user requirements methods. But most of the time these happen a little bit later in the process, when there is already some prototype of the system. So of course it might be that in a later stage in this project we will also conduct these types of methods. Okay, that's it for me. I'm going to give the floor to Nick.
Okay, hi. Before we continue, I saw there were some questions from Erik Hein. Maybe you can have a short look at it, Emma, and see if you can address those questions.
I will. Sorry, I didn't see it. Where is recent systematic review meta-analysis that police does not do well in high-risk situations? I'm not aware of a meta-analysis. Most of the research that I know of is already also conducted. A lot of it is conducted by another partner in our consortium, which is Raoul Audience, where they did see that shooting accuracy, for example, and speed declined when police officers were put under high anxious or stressful states levels. So yes, I agree. There's not really a meta-analysis. There's not a lot of different research, but the research that I did find were, of course, different studies, but did show that there is an influence, can also be positive, a positive or negative impact on performance, on decision making in the field when stress is high. So there is some research that shows that traditional methods of training do not sufficiently incorporate this these emotional and physical states, or do not mimic them good enough, which is why that in some instances when you then go into the field, that there are some external influences that influence your performance, even though you do very well in your training, that it can distort in a way your performance. But I think more research is indeed necessary. Which model of decision making do you use? I refer back to Raoul Audience, who has I'm sorry, I kind of forgot the title, but it's a model that is based on goal-oriented versus stimulus-oriented. I forgot the name. Really, I will look it up when Nick does his presentation. But that's the model that we use in ShotPros, and it kind of states that you can get, if you have a goal-oriented focus, then you keep at the task at hand, while when you are stimulus-oriented, then you can start to get a negative impact on your decision making. But I will look it up. In EM. You mentioned scenario-based training. What do you mean with that concept? Scenario-based training is actually simulation training. You can compare it with that. So where you reenact, or where you put trainees in a real life or virtual, but in a situation as they would in real life, and you have them perform the way they would in real life. So it's based on simulation training. That's the aspect. Is event-based training not limited and better general competencies? Wait, sorry. Is VR missing real consequences, danger, pain? This was an issue that was brought up by many end users. It was a discussion because many end users, or many users, they think that VR will always be just a game and will not be able to achieve similar states of mind as they would in real life. Probably not maybe exactly the same, but they can, I think, but Nick can answer that better. They can mimic similar states, but maybe not exactly the same. But then again, and that's also a question that we are working on in our project, do we need exactly the same state of mind, or is just something that is similar, would that be sufficient enough to kind of sorry, I don't know the word, elicit the impact that stress can have? Concerning pain, we have in our requirements, our system requirements, a lot of the users, they did want that certain decisions that they made, if these decisions were not good decisions, or if they would get hurt during a scenario, that they would feel some pain stimulus. So they all felt very strongly to have haptic feedback, so suits where they can get some sense of touch, and that when they get shot, that they feel it, and that there's a small pain stimulus, maybe not really pain, but something that is not nice, not pleasant. So that's something that they mentioned they wanted, but then again, others said, okay, but we have restrictions, we cannot induce pain in our trainees. So again, a constraint, possible constraint. And of course, yeah, danger. But that all depends, but Nick will tell you more about that. Also on the level of immersion, I think, if you are, if you have a VR scenario, a system where you are very much immersed in the VR as if it was a real environment, then, and that's, studies have shown that you experience very similar psychological states as you would in real life situations. This, of course, that being said, as a researcher, also elicits some ethical questions on if it's so lifelike to have training in VR, should we not also have the same type of aftercare? Because if they experience similar psychological states as they would in real life situations, then perhaps, of course, the consequences, the psychological consequences can also feel real. So in that case, you also have an ethical dimension that you have to take into consideration. Sorry, I will. In aviation event-based training, it is now questioned because it is too limited and case-specific. Does scenario-based training have the same limitation? Yes. I think it does. It does in a way that if you have scenario-based training, to really benefit from scenario-based training, you have to be able to train a lot of different scenarios. So the idea behind it is that you have to generalize your competencies across different situations to also be able to apply them in new situations. So the more you practice different types of scenarios, the more you can also use these memories of, okay, I've seen this before in new situations. So the idea of scenario-based training is that you can train a very diverse range of scenarios. And that is where I think scenario-based training succeeds or fails. If you have only 1 or 2 or 3 scenarios that you have to constantly reuse, you will not have the learning potential and the learning benefits that you want to achieve. So you really have to work on developing a large library of different scenarios. And in our case, I think you have different scenarios, but also different levels of complexity. So you can add elements constantly and change maybe some baseline scenarios, but change them in a way that they become completely new scenarios. So you have to be able to play a little bit with all the elements and make sure that you can offer a variety of scenarios. Okay, sorry. I think I'm going to give the floor to Nick. Eric, I see that you asked a number of other questions, but maybe we can discuss them later after Nick's presentation. Okay, thank you.
Hi. So now I'm going to talk about the technical analysis. So what are we doing as a company? It doesn't really differ for us a lot if we're doing this within the project, the ShotPros project, or with other clients or customers, because basically where it starts for us is with the list of requirements. So the LIA can have a list which they give to us, and they say, okay, we're looking for a system and it should be able to do this, 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 this. Can you please give us an estimate if you can do it, and for what price? So what we will do is, okay, we will look at your requirements and we pick them apart. So we, with the software developers and hardware developers, we will sit down and we go through the list of requirements, and then we will look, okay, what can we already do, and what do we need to develop, and so the hardware team in this case will look at, okay, the police officer needs to be able to use non-lethal weapons in a scenario. This will have implications for us, so we need to develop new hardware that we did not have before, or maybe partially did not have. But the software developers will also need to think about, okay, so if we have a taser in the scenario, what kinds of effect do we expect to see if we use the taser? So because then we have to make all kinds of animations of characters walking around, maybe they behave violently. Okay, an officer shoots at the suspect with a taser, it has a certain effect, or maybe it doesn't, so that all needs programming. So we go step by step to make a technical analysis of all the functional requirements that the LIA wants. And in this case, we focus in the ShotPros project, we focused on domestic violence. So they specified all the requirements to be able to train a domestic violence scenario. And also one of the requirements was not from the LIAs, but from the universities to research when a police officer is under stress. So that was an additional requirement. So then we have a lot of things to look at. And this slide just summarize it with a couple of pictures. But basically what we end up doing is look at all the individual requirements, and at the end we have basically an Excel sheet of everything that needs to be developed, and how many development hours it will cost, what kind of electronics we need to buy, because at the end we have to be able to do something within a certain budget, because all resources are limited. So the LIA, or in this case the ShotPros project, has a certain budget, because certain requirements maybe need to be dropped, or maybe we can include more requirements, but we can only decide after we made an initial analysis. Now we have rough estimation, okay, all these requirements. At the end, it will cost us this amount of time, therefore it will have this price tag. Okay, and then it can go back to the group, or the LIAs, and they say, okay, are we okay with it? Because most of the times it will include some trade-offs. Okay, therefore it would be very useful to specify in the requirements what is really needed and what is a lower priority. So then we know, okay, where we going to lay our focus. And many times that is a little bit back and forth. So we made the analysis, we do a debrief or back brief. Okay, this is our findings. We think we can do a little bit more on this subject, but maybe we cannot do all the hardware you want. So for example, in this ShotPros project, it is not doable to give all the police officers their own specific pistol. But is it really needed that you have it? That is a question that that we might ask. It can be that it's really needed. Okay, if you're looking at a training that's very specific for shooting and shooting techniques, yeah, then the conclusion can be, okay, it really matters that everybody has its own gun. In this case, they said no, it doesn't really matter because it's only about the decision that I draw my weapon and use deadly force. Okay, and the trade-off is, okay, I can, as a police officer, live with the limitation that it's not exactly the real gun as in real life. But I find it more important that I can choose between 2 non-lethal weapons and 1 lethal weapon. Okay, so long story short, we start with a list of functional requirements that we receive from the LIAS. We make the technical analysis. We make a summary of all the implications it has for us and all the costs, and then we go back to the LIAS and we present it and they say, okay, are you okay with this? And if everybody's happy, then we continue into the next phase. So right now, can you go to the next slide? Yes. So right now we are in this phase of the development, testing, and delivery. So after we agreed upon, okay, these requirements are going to be developed, we start developing. So basically from left to right, you see an arrow. We start designing stuff. Internally we call it sprints. Maybe people are familiar with the term that is often being used within the IT sector. Sprints are basically short periods of time where we are going to take one requirement or maybe multiple requirements and we are going to develop until we reach a point that we say, okay, this item is now ready for testing. So after 2 or maybe 3 weeks, we have designed maybe a taser and with some basic functionalities that are ready for testing. Okay, so we have developed it and then we're going to test. And of course, it's never perfect. We get feedback internally. We're going to do a new sprint and we are going to develop it until we reach the point that we have defined as, okay, this is okay, and we go to the next item. So then we just check the box. Okay, we go to the next item. So we go to sprint, test, sprint, test, and we go in this case from the bottom up. That means all the small elements are developed, and then okay, we go to the next level. So at a certain point, for instance, in the ShotPros project, we have developed all the police gear that you normally wear in the tactical belt, and then we can maybe build a small scenario to see if everything is working like we hope it's working. Okay, then we come to the conclusion. Okay, the pistol is working fine, the pepper spray is working fine, but the taser is not completely as we want it. So that goes back to the drawing board. We do a new sprint, testing, etc. And in the end phase, we put everything together, because now I was talking about some hardware examples with software components as well. But in the background, we can have like major software developments, like, okay, the scenario size that is required for a certain scenario is very big. So in this case, we need to go to completely new game engine. So that is the game engine is, for example, the software that enables everything that you see around you in the virtual environment. These are major implications that will basically continue from the beginning until the end. But in the end phase, we as a company, we bring everything together, and we do basically the end user testing. So that would mean, okay, we create the scenario as described by the LIAs. We might do it in the beginning ourselves, or we invite some of the LIAs to do the testing with us and give us the latest feedback. And we do the final adjustments until we deliver the system. So this is basically how it looks internally for us. I know it doesn't really go differently in other companies. Basically, all companies are doing short sprints with testing, sprints and testing, because in the world of coding, if you spend 100% of the time coding, it's 10% designing and 90% fixing the errors that are in the code. So yeah, that's basically my my story from the technical side. I don't know if there are any further questions. I don't see any in the chat. Otherwise, I would say, okay, thank you for your time, and I hope this webinar helped you to get a little insights in what's going on at ShotPro's project, and also helps you maybe in the future think about how to define requirements and then hand it over to the industry, or maybe it helps you to write a tender in the future to acquire certain systems. All right.
Nick, I think Eric has a question about immersion.
Yeah. Okay,
maybe you can answer that.
What about immersion? What are immersion factors, and can they also be used in low fidelity training? Yeah, immersion, yeah, that is basically all the senses that you have in your body. Smell, what I see. So that can be, okay, I see a person with a weapon, but it can also be facial expressions, touch. At this moment, for example, we use haptic feedback for letting you know you're touching an object or touching a person, because in virtual reality, everything is fake. So if you touch a door or an object or a car, you will see it, but you won't feel it, and it can be quite annoying in tactical training. So we looked at, okay, how can we replicate that feeling? And then we said, okay, we do that by vibration. So if you touch something with your hand or your arm, you will feel sensors vibrating. What are immersion factors that can also be used in low fidelity training? Yeah, basically all the factors that we have designed can be used. So we don't have smell, but everything else can be used. The University of Amsterdam said, okay, it's the technology is on a certain level that it's immersive enough. So I think that that's quite positive. They saw that during a test with the Dutch police, and by my own experience, I've seen, okay, it is realistic enough to have low fidelity training as well. Another small question: can we rewatch the webinar? I think we can, because Valerie told me that this is being recorded and is going to be placed on YouTube. So yes, Erik, did I answer your question properly, or you have more questions about immersion factors? Yeah, yeah. Another thing I can say about that is that it's an ongoing development effort from our side to expand the immersion. It is never ending. The goal is to make it as realistic as possible. And I think it also depends a little bit on the training audience, on what kind of immersion do you need to reach the training goal. That's how I see it. I don't know what your opinion is about it, but yeah, we try to make it as immersive as possible. We do a lot of simulation training in emergency med, but sometimes difficult to get immersed, even with VR. Yes, that is true. I think it has to do a large part with real life consequences that are missing. If I'm doing a training in VR, at the end of the day, I know I'm gonna go home in one piece. And in a real life scenario, that might not be the case. So, and the question is, how do you replicate that feeling? That can maybe be by inducing pain, but even then, I think especially if you're training more often in a system, you know that the consequences will not be really severe. So yeah, you know, you can afford the mistake, blah blah blah. And that is also in live training, especially with certain trainings that have limitations. But I've seen a real life fire training that can have high stress. That's because the training, if you make a mistake, can have very bad consequences. So yeah, my personal feeling is that it has to do with, okay, if I make a mistake in training, do I end up in hospital or maybe even die? That will make it very immersive. But yeah, that is something that's also unethical that we cannot do. Other questions? There is nice research about training which helps. Okay. Can you give us or give me the link or the name of the paper? Then I'm more than happy to have a look at it. I have to look it up for you. Okay, great. Yeah, in the next slide, Emma has our contact details, so you feel free to send it to us, or if you feel like asking us other questions later, you can always send us an email. Yeah, we're also learning all the time, so if you have great ideas or insights, please send it over, and maybe we can do something with it. Thank you.
Thank you.